The Royce Abbey Peace Oration is named in honour of past Rotary International President Royce Abbey, who gave the inaugural oration in 2000. Since then, the District Peace Communities program has held many peace orations, usually to celebrate the United Nations International Day of Peace on September 21st. I would like to welcome Professor Fiona White to give this year's Royce Abbey Peace Oration.
Hello everybody. I'll just maybe get the first slide up. Thanks. That's the title for today, The Many Forms of Peace and Regeneration. So regeneration is one of the driving forces for Rotary. So we're talking about prejudice and racism and its reduction, and how a prejudice-free society is actually a peaceful society. So it's really changing this notion of peace around to this idea of a prejudice-free society. So that's really where I'm going to begin. Before I begin, acknowledgement of country, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Wiradjuri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which I usually reside. That's the Gadigal people of the Oration Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I might just stay on that original slide, because like Catherine, I also want to begin with a personal story and an introduction before I get started. Look, it's my great honour and privilege to be invited to present the 11th Royce Abbey Peace Oration. The principles of the Rotary Priest Credo, just there in front of us: respect for everyone, rejection of violence, resolution of conflict, reconciliation of differences, and freedom of expression and diversity strongly resonate with my research, which advances new and effective strategies to promote fair and harmonious society for all. And it's really important, I think, and timely that this oration is happening today, because most of you will know that Monday, the 21st of March, is also the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So it really is preparatory, not just as a peace oration, but also a racial discrimination and elimination oration. So they really do coincide and go hand in hand. I'd also, before I begin, like to thank Deirdre and Philip for their support and taking care of me today at this conference. It's been an absolutely amazing first lot of sessions today. And a lot of the topics that were discussed in the earlier sessions about inclusion, diversity, finding a cause, having a cause, create engagement, increase membership, feeling connected to a community. These ideas are really going to permeate a lot of this oration as well. So again, there's a great fluidity between this morning's sessions and this oration. But here's my personal story, and it's one Catherine also started with. I mean, she mentioned the importance of personal stories, because what that does is hopefully connect you and me together on this. And my story really begins with my father, Tony White. He came from a city called Colombo in Sri Lanka. In fact, I was also born in Colombo in Sri Lanka. My dad was a civil and structural engineer who was one of the first Sri Lankans to secure a Duke of Edinburgh scholarship to study a Masters in Engineering at Leeds University. After he'd finished his masters and married mum, they returned to Colombo, and Dad started to work as an engineer, and he worked his way through the engineering ranks. He built important roads, he built important infrastructures such as bridges and hospitals, and in his work it was just so esteemed that he caught the eye of an engineering company called Arab Engineering. It was a global firm, and they offered him a job, and he could choose between going to Canada or to Sydney, and fortunately he chose Sydney. So, grabbing the life-changing opportunity with both hands, in 1972, Dad packed up his family of 6, which included Mum, myself, my 2 elder brothers, and his elderly dad. And we all headed down under. And I guess the rest, they say, is history. And I retell this story with great fondness and gratitude, reflecting on how fortunate I was to have caring and hard-working parents who realised the importance of education for creating better opportunities, not just for themselves, but also for their children. My early life experiences also taught me that education not only opens minds, but it literally opens doors. This personal story of mine has led to my lifelong goal to educate and foster knowledge about the practical strategies we can all put into place and practice to promote equality, justice and peace for all. But what led me to my research focus in psychology on prejudice? Why prejudice? Well, I guess it's all in my name, specifically my surname of White. All through school in the 1970s and 80s in Sydney, I was made aware by others around me that my brown skin colour did not match my surname. And all of the kids, and my friends included, often said, "Fiona, you really should be called Fiona Brown or Fiona Black." And this kind of really permeated. And we'd laugh and we'd joke and it was fine. But at the same time, I didn't think that much of these comments. But clearly being a walking, what we call in social psychology, counter-stereotype, meaning my surname is White, my colour's brown, remained this kind of unconscious source of dissonance for me. Even to this day, when I have a new student come into my office or a new staff member come into the School of Psychology, they'll knock on my door, they'll see me sitting at my desk, and they'll still ask, is Professor White in? Can I speak to Professor White? And I still reply, you're speaking to her. So ultimately, my entry into this really challenging arena of research and policy on self-reflection is an entirely personal one. Okay. Look, what I really also want to spend the oration on is about the solutions, about some practical things both you and I can do, and as Rotarians and community members can do, to really increase inclusiveness, increase diversity with cooperation, and also the policy challenges that we might all have for this peaceful, prejudice-free society that we all kind of wish for and desire. I'll just start with a few definitions. What is prejudice? Well, as the name suggests, it's about prejudging people based on their race, religion, gender, age, sexuality, and or other minority statuses. Prejudice more often than not, however, involves these negative beliefs, feelings of intentions towards a person based on a prejudgment we make about the whole group in which they belong to. For example, Chris is a lazy X and all people who are X are lazy. So we judge an individual based on their group membership rather than looking at the individual and getting to know them as an individual. Now, during these COVID-19 times, society is bombarded with news about vaccines for these biologically based viruses. However, However, we can no longer ignore the ongoing costs of the more intangible social virus that we know as racial prejudice. The social virus, racial prejudice, has remained resistant to treatment interventions for many centuries and millennia. And I think there's really several reasons for why prejudice as a social virus is so resistant. And here's some ideas that I have for this resistance. One, not everyone is equally affected. Prejudice tends to impact the minority or the social group with less power and privilege in our society. Two, unlike biologically based viruses detected under microscopes, prejudice is not easily to detect or directly visible sometimes, especially to those who have positions of power and privilege. Three, because prejudice is more difficult to detect than these biological viruses, it tends to be ignored by governments and policy makers, especially when it comes to allocating funding to reducing it. Four, its complexity can sometimes be difficult to explain, especially by those impacted by it, because prejudice mutates between complicated feelings, attitudes, behaviours, and thoughts like, was I not given that promotion because of who I am or the group I belong to, or was it just because I wasn't as strong as the other candidate? So that self-questioning can come into it. And five, prejudice can provide its holders or proponents with an addictive sense of power and privilege, both of which are difficult to relinquish. So there's some of the reasons this social virus I'm calling prejudice can be quite resistant to change. So much of my research over the last 25 years shows that the forms of prejudice in Australia have changed from very blatant forms of prejudice such as racial slurs, name calling, things like that, to more subtle modern forms of prejudice, such as the structural barriers I just mentioned, getting a promotion in the workplace, not being invited to drinks on Friday night, not being given leadership positions in your departments in hospitals or in schools or in universities. But here's the critical point. Whether you're a target of either the blatant form or this more modern subtle form of prejudice, all the research shows that targets experience the same negative psycho-emotional responses. These psycho-emotional costs have wider ramifications. For example, a colleague of mine, Professor Yin Paradis from Deakin University, estimated that racism costs the Australian economy approximately $38 billion per year due to losses brought on by poor mental health, unemployment, and not feeling included in the consequences of that. Today, the COVID-19 pandemic has added yet another layer of complexity. The global statistics show that racial and ethnic minorities and the social inequalities they experience have been exacerbated in the past 2 years of the pandemic, particularly when it comes to equal and affordable access to healthcare, vaccines, rapid antigen tests, etc. So worryingly, here in Australia, in particular, Chinese communities are experiencing more adverse economic and psychological health outcomes due to the racial discrimination related to COVID-19. Colleagues of mine, researchers Kassim and Su, have reported that 1 in 5 Chinese Australians, so 20% of Chinese Australians, experienced physical threats or attacks since November 2020. And many attribute COVID-19 pandemic for this recent wave of racial discrimination. So like its biological counterpart, prejudice must be eradicated. We all have a role to play in ensuring a peaceful solution and set in place to regenerate Australia's social and civic fabric. So here are all of my potential solutions. I felt today has been really upbeat about positive things that we can all do, and I want to continue that conversation here. These are all solutions that we can put in place. So personally and academically, I focus on finding solutions to problems and issues. I don't want to focus on the problems. And this oration today is going to reflect a solution-focused agenda. For all of us to live in a more respectful, peaceful and inclusive society, everything we've talked about this morning here, and a society that we all desire, top-down, multi-pronged approach is needed. We need everyone involved. We need governments, media, teachers, parents, you and me, all contributing to finding and implementing solutions to eliminate prejudice, particularly as Monday fast approaches as the International Day for the Elimination of Racism. My solution-focused research is being guided by an eminent social psychologist. See, when we get into academia, and some of you know of this, we kind of get thrown into a PhD, we get told about certain researchers that are prominent in that area, and we're told to read about them. So when I started my PhD in 1990, there was a name that came up, and his name was Professor Gordon Allport, and he wrote this famous text in 1954 called The Nature of Prejudice. And Allport was living in this pre-civil rights America where there was physical segregation between white Americans and African Americans. And so Allport said, well, why is this segregation still existing in 1954? Let me write my observations down. And he wrote these 4 factors that he noticed might help in reducing prejudice. And this is what he wrote. This is a direct quote from his book. Prejudice may be reduced by equal status contact between the majority and the minority in pursuit of common goals. The effect is greatly enhanced if this contact is sanctioned by institutional supports, such as governments, and provided it is a sort that leads to the perception that the common interests and common goals and the common humanity can actually be achieved between these 2 members, the minority and the majority group member. Now, whilst Allport identified these conditions for reducing prejudice, he left it up to social psychologists that came after him to actually develop interventions and experiments and studies to test his ideas. This became and has been the focus of my academic pursuit for the past 25 years, and the foundation of today's Royce Abbey Peace Oration. Allport identified that prejudice reduction needs to be sanctioned by institutional support. That was one of his conditions. So let's start at the top with the government's role in reducing racial prejudice. There's no more powerful institution than the government, especially when it comes to leading the way in promoting peace and regeneration by fostering a prejudice-free society. So there's my slide of the government, our government, not that far away from here. And I've got some dot points here about what I think the government can do, either government, bipartisan. This is not targeting one political party over another. I think this is an all of government strategy that should be put forward in the future. 1, revive and renew a national anti-racism strategy. The previous anti-racism strategy, previous national anti-racism strategy ceased in 2015. We haven't had one for 7 years. Some of you might think, did we ever have one? I didn't remember hearing about it. And so the only reason I know that there was one in 2015 is because I was part of the Human Rights Commission that helped create it. So again, it was there, didn't get much press, didn't get much promotion, didn't get much implementation, and that's always a problem with government policy. But it's 7 years since we've had one, and I think what could really be a cornerstone of a new one with the new government that may be put in power after May, and that is part of that strategy could involve funding support for a national school curriculum focusing on racism reduction. And I'll come toward that idea toward the end of this oration. So, an anti-racism strategy, 1. 2, considering the rebranding possibly of January 26th as Australia Day. Because what that would do is that would show our empathy, it would show our consultation with our fellow First Nations people and the negative psycho-emotional impact that that day continues to have on them and their allies and their supporters. You just need to speak to your friends and your colleagues who are First Nations people, and they will tell you of what pain that day causes them, that name causes them. 3, recognise our First Nations people in the Australian Constitution. Australia's First Nations people are still not mentioned in our Constitution, despite a recommendation in 2017 by the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So that's 5 years old now. Changes to national legislation in this area is still clearly urgently needed. And yes, there's governments talking about this, but they're still in action. 3, that was 3. 4, have more culturally diverse communication in our parliament. So more diverse representation. Diversity has been a real message in today's conference. Everyone has talked about making membership more diverse. Well, diversity also needs to occur in Parliament House. Related to this, some of you may know of this 2021 Australia Talk survey, where 60,000 Australians responded to this survey. 66% of that 60,000 respondents said that they think an Indigenous voice in Parliament should be enshrined in our Constitution. So clearly there's support from us. It's kind of the government that's kind of slow on this in responding to what 66% of Australians are requesting. They're just 4 things. I'm sure all of you can think of other things the government can do. But until the past is acknowledged and rectified, Australia and we, its people, cannot really move forward as a united nation. And that's something we really need to do, particularly during these difficult times where we're seeing peace really questioned around the world. We are a strong nation. Let's strengthen it. And these are ways that the government can strengthen it. The other solution, so that's the government solution, the other solution is the media. What's the media's role in perpetuating racial difference, racial discord, racial discrimination? Well, one thing the media could do is represent multicultural Australia on mainstream TV. Most news and morning shows, remain predominantly white. Ironically, it is in the reality television genre, things like MasterChef, I don't know how many of you watch that, My Kitchen Rules, Gogglebox, it's on that kind of reality TV where we see cultural diversity represented on our TV, and it's usually in the form of contestants on those shows. And this is providing greater diversity, what we need of reporters, show hosts, judges, and maybe guests on these mainstream TV shows, suggesting that there's still a long way for us to go as a nation. Secondly, the media can also, show minorities more accurately and favourably on TV. Accurate and favourable representations of culturally and other diverse minorities on our screens are important because it acknowledges they are included. It acknowledges their contributions are recognised and that they are respected and that they are understood. That's what representation does. In contrast, the absence of diversity, the absence of diverse people on our TV screens or in the media sends the message that they are invisible, do not exist and are not important. This is not appropriate for social progress in a modern 21st century Australia. We can do better than that. So the power of the media in providing more accurate and culturally diverse representations shouldn't be underestimated. It's important. It tells a message. Remember, for some people, their TV is the only opportunity for them to have contact with someone from a culturally diverse background. So the TV does, media, social media plays a really important role in representation. It shouldn't be underestimated because for some communities that lack cultural diversity, that is the only opportunity they get to see cultural diversity. So we shouldn't underestimate the media's role. Okay, parents and teachers' role, the third group of people. Prominent child psychologists Frances Abood and Melanie Klein have shown prejudice to emerge around the ages of 3. That's a young age in which racial prejudice is emerging. And it continues to influence our life through our development. When we exclude others who are different to us, intentionally or unintentionally, we do this because we're relying on faulty and negative stereotypes, about these people. These negative thoughts and beliefs in turn impact maybe our behaviour. We might exclude them from meetings. We mightn't include them in everything that we're talking about when it comes to policy. And it becomes a vicious cycle. Our negative beliefs impact our exclusion, and then our exclusion reinforces our negative beliefs. So the first step is to break and disrupt this vicious cycle. That's what researchers, Rotarians, colleagues, collaborators try to do in this area of racism reduction. Parents and teachers also play a role, and that's where I want to focus. Parents and teachers can intervene before stereotypes and prejudice become deeply entrenched in children. Let's focus on parents. Parents are the first and initially the most influential role models in our children's lives. Racism and prejudice is learned. We're not born racist, we learn it. My research has shown that children are constantly watching, scrutinising us, copying us, internalising our parents' behaviours and opinions. They listen to everything we say and do, including things related to prejudice and racism. Subsequently, parents need to self-reflect as to how much cultural diversity they have in their home and whether their children are aware of or a part of diverse groups. Parents can regulate the types of games and toys that they give their children, the books that they give their children, the TV programs they allow their children to watch, especially with regards to the extent and accurate depiction of culturally diverse groups, of how friendships across these groups are represented. In addition to these practical steps, parents can influence their child's exposure to different types of friendship groups by encouraging neighbourhood friendships, watching educational programs about cultural diversity, or introducing their children to different foods or cuisines in the household. Some schools may be subject to zoning, and that way, parents might find it difficult to send their children to more culturally diverse schools. But if the school isn't subject to zoning, can you send your child to a more culturally diverse school? Is it possible? So really, this racism reduction begins at home. Why not begin today by asking yourself, how many cross-group friends does my family have? And what is the quality of these connections? The other area I focused on, and some of you may know me from, is the ABC documentary called School That Tried to End Racism, and it aired last year. It met with a lot of success. I co-hosted it with Mark Fennell, who you can see there. These were some of the students that were involved in that program, and as you may know, it was a highly successful program that reduced racial attitudes and behaviour by the end of the 3 weeks. So related to this, teachers also can encourage cross-group friendship interactions in the classroom by having culturally diverse students work together to complete group projects. Achieving a common goal together in the classroom can break down the boundaries of us versus them. And that's come up in today's sessions. Why don't we work together on things? When we work together on things, we stop seeing us and them, and we see a we. We see a group, a collaboration. So that's very important.